I was not expecting this. I was expecting an episode that continued the storyline of Top Hat and Sketchpad in part 4, but this episode went in a completely different direction. And this direction was to focus on Spray Paint and Mouse's backstory, which is something that I found to be a pretty interesting direction for the episode. As some of you may know if you watched my review of the Nightly Manor Chapter 1, I found Spray Paint and Mouse's backstory to be very underdeveloped. And before this episode was released, out of all the duos in the Nightly Manor, their background seemed to be the least fleshed out. And with the slower pacing that the show now seems to be inheriting, this episode provided a really good idea of their relationship. As I've said before, one of the Nightly Manor's greatest flaws were in Chapter 1, where the pacing felt way too fast and unstable, which made for a story that felt awkwardly put together and left barely any room for moments to feel impactful. But the way this episode really took its time to introduce Spray Paint and Mouse's upbringing was very well handled. The idea of the two being former criminals was an unexpected but refreshing turn for the show to take. Being introduced to their posse was also a good time. They're a fun group to watch. I like how nearly everyone in the team takes advantage of their object designs to break into the vault. The group has a very clear synergy with each other. Spray Paint's relationship with the group is also very clearly shown. It's easy to see that he's been yearning to prove himself to his team, and that makes a lot of sense when considering how neglected and useless he feels in comparison to everyone else in the group. His relationship is a bit simple, but very easily understandable, and it helps flesh out his dynamic with Mouse as well. Once the two of them get laid off from their posse, it's shown that Spray Paint's desire to prove himself useful is still present with his relationship with Mouse. It's shown that he wants to be the provider for the two of them, and he can't stand the fact that he isn't even able to do that properly. When he tries to prove to his posse that he can be useful, he ends up getting laid off, leaving them with no source of income. When he tries to find a job, he ends up getting rejected, winds up in a drunken rage, and assaults a police officer, which gets the two of them in jail. So yeah, not doing too great. And when they're in jail, he still tries to prove himself useful by attempting to get out of their cell to no avail. His constant need to show the people around him that he isn't useless is with him at all times. He describes it as an itchy feeling that makes him crave to be someone that people can count on, and he detests how he can only seem to let people down. And when he says all this to Mouse, she tells him how he doesn't need to prove himself to anyone. No matter what happens to them, she'll still deeply value her friendship with him. Mouse is shown to appreciate Spray's efforts despite his constant failure. Their bond is too important for her to see Spray Paint as anything less than her friend. Put simply, this is what I've been looking for. This episode alone has probably brought Spray Paint and Mouse's relationship from the least fleshed out in the series to the most fleshed out, and that is great to see. I really enjoy their dynamic. There's a deep mutual sense of care that they have for each other, something that we haven't seen nearly as much of in any of the other relationships. This is why slower pacing works in the show's favor so much better. This episode was able to be much more effective by taking its time to show the upbringing of these two characters, and it was able to be monumentally more effective that way. Especially more effective than that 20-second flashback from Chapter 1. That moment feels even more pointless now that we have Part 5. Now, it's really cool to see more from these two, but they're not the only ones that get some extra development. Speaker and Ring are also given a bit of extra backstory, and while it's nothing huge, it's still nice to see a little more of them. It's shown that Speaker's job has been pretty difficult for him. There were times when he started to doubt his abilities as a detective. And we get to see him interact with Spray Paint and Mouse before the events of Chapter 1. Granted, not with the best introduction in the world. He also gets a cute little moment where he comforts Spray Paint and Mouse in their cell. That was nice to see. And from the little screen time we got of Ring, it's shown that she seems to be the manager of a jewelry store, and she seems to take her job pretty seriously. Now, it's cool to see returning characters and all, but it also makes me question some things. For instance, the more Nightly Manor episodes that come out, the more I start to question how Sketchpad was able to become a certified detective, and this episode is making me reach some sort of breaking point. I get it, Sketchpad is a silly guy, and being ridiculous is just part of his character, but this episode got me pretty annoyed about it. Sketchpad might be goofy, but this episode especially seems to be taking the world building much more seriously. The whole detective agency is also given more of a focus in this episode, and it's treated with full seriousness. And yet, despite this seriousness, we're just shown Sketchpad's desk and how childish it looks, as if the show's saying, hey, don't forget, he still works here, isn't that funny? This episode takes place 1 year ago, and he's only fired after the events of Chapter 1. And yet, in this episode, it's hinted at through some dialogue from Speaker that Sketchpad has burnt down a building in at least one of his previous cases. Are you seriously meaning to tell me that over the course of an entire year, he gets fired for getting his partner killed, but not for committing arson? Even the smallest reason for why he has this job would satisfy me, like his tiny size makes him more useful in some cases, or maybe he just lied on his resume. Another thing that doesn't make sense to me with this episode is the fact that he and Speaker are partners. I would love to see how that happened. We've barely had any scenes where the two of them actually interact, and I can't imagine them having that much chemistry since Speaker takes his job way more seriously than Sketchpad does. But hey, maybe they have a great great dynamic. Maybe they're the best of buds, but wouldn't this episode have been the best time to show that? Is even one scene with the two of them interacting be asking for too much? Instead, this particular episode insisted on highlighting how much of a big deal Speaker's job is to him, which is another quality that he and Sketchpad don't seem to share. So it kinda just left me wishing that this episode fleshed out their relationship a bit more. Sketchpad's screen time is something that I never thought I'd be wanting more of, and yet here we are! The fact that he used to be a qualified detective is starting to feel more and more shoehorned into the narrative, and the way the show is treating it lightheartedly, even though the whole detective agency is being treated seriously, and yet they still don't bother to explain why Sketchpad's a detective, it all just feels so awkward. But obviously, both of these issues can be explained later on in the show, and I seriously hope they do, because if they're gonna put this much effort into making these characters' stories intertwine this much, then it's important for the show to also put effort into having a good idea of how all these characters got to where they are now. Now, there's one more thing about Speaker's addition to this episode that I'm not a fan of, and it's related to my biggest problem with this episode. I like how Spray Paint and Mouse have a little history with Speaker now, but I don't like how this episode is using that fact to help fix Chapter 1. This might not actually be the case, but it really does come off that way for me. What makes me think that they're trying to fix Chapter 1? The fact that this episode literally begins with a retcon. The episode opens up during the events of Chapter 1, where Spray Paint and Mouse share a cute little moment together. Spray Paint is worried about being suspected as the killer, and Mouse comforts him, saying that she believes he's innocent. Then Speaker comes in and warmly tells Spray Paint to look after Sketchpad for him, hinting that Spray Paint and Speaker have some sort of history with each other and that Speaker trusts him with his partner. They really try to seamlessly weave this into the narrative, but it feels so forceful, and it really doesn't fix much. We get a cute scene with Spray Paint and Mouse, which is nice, but this interaction that Spray Paint had with Speaker still doesn't make sense to me. It seems that this interaction exists to prove that Speaker is trusting of Spray Paint because of the interaction between them that's shown later on in the episode, but Chapter 1 never features a single other scene that shows that Speaker knew Spray Paint before. He still splits the two of them up for no reason, which is really stupid if he's supposed to understand how much they mean to each other. And in fact, remember when Mouse literally dies and Spray Paint is mourning the loss of his friend and Speaker is just completely unfazed? Isn't Speaker supposed to be aware of how important Mouse was to Spray Paint at this point? He's not even gonna at least say sorry? Plus, I don't understand how this interaction made Speaker think that Spray Paint was a trustworthy guy. Even though this episode shows that the two of them have known each other in the past, it's not like they were ever good pals. What part of Spray Paint being drunk while punching Speaker in the eye, getting arrested, and pouring his heart out to his friend made him think that Spray Paint would be responsible or trustworthy?
Hey Spray, remember that time you assaulted me and then had an emotional moment with your friend in jail? Yeah, good times. Anyway, I trust you to take care of my valued partner for me, even though many of us are suspicious of you. Bye!
I get that this was Speaker giving Spray Paint a chance to prove himself, something that he understands Spray Paint has been yearning to do, but is this really the best time to thrust this amount of responsibility onto him? Spray Paint literally talked about how he keeps letting people down. You're seriously gonna trust him with the life of your partner? Stuff like this is why I'm pretty certain that the opening scene in Part 5 was nothing more than a retcon. This scene does not fit with the pacing of Chapter 1 at all, and what's funny is that it's not because it's bad or anything, it's because the way it's written does not fit the way Chapter 1 was written. If this was always meant to have happened during the events of Chapter 1, then this scene would have stuck out like a sore thumb. Also, I just want to say that if I'm wrong about this, and this was always meant to be canon to Chapter 1 when it was being written, and they just purposefully didn't have it in that chapter because they wanted to reveal that it happened later on just for the sake of revealing it later on, then that does not make anything better. That is in fact just straight up terrible writing. If you want an in-depth explanation for why I think this, check out the pinned comment below or pause to read it right here. I'm not going to explain in this video since this is a tangent that isn't really a criticism of the Nightly Manor, it's more so just me ranting about a possibility for the show. I just really don't think that we should be focusing on fixing Chapter 1. It's clear that the series is in a much better place now than it was before. The amount of newfound love and care that's being put into the show now really shows. Like, I consider Part 4 alone to be leagues better than the entirety of Chapter 1. Same thing with Part 5. I think it's safe to say that the team has improved drastically. I just personally wish that we could spend all of our time on adding on to the series rather than quote-unquote fixing the past, because I don't think it was handled very well in this episode, and I really don't think that focusing on this more is going to accomplish much. Alright, enough about the past, let's talk about the visuals in this episode. The animation is as nice as ever. It never fails to look simple yet nice and slick at all times. Sure, now that the show has a larger team of animators, there are some noticeable style shifts at points, but it's never anything too distracting. But do not get me started on the backgrounds. This episode has the widest variety of locations yet, and the background designers went wild with them. Some of these places look fantastic. These backgrounds give a sense of life and scope that the show just hasn't had quite as much of until this point in the series. They're just so detailed, whether it be cute little references to Alan's previous work or just straight up beautiful coloring and lighting. They evoke such a strong sense of life and variation that gives the town so much more personality than before. And something that especially complements these areas is the music that's used alongside some of them. With the music and backgrounds working in such harmony, some of these places give a very strong sense of atmosphere. And no scene makes use of both the visuals and the music nearly as well as this scene. First off, let me get it out of the way. Yes, it is really cool to see Spray Paint alive. And honestly, it really does make sense that he survived since we were given barely any details about the explosion. But I was more taken aback by how beautifully he was revealed. You want to talk about musical and visual harmonization? This is the scene for you. The way the poignant instrumental gorgeously complements the dark, gloomy atmosphere of the hospital room makes this scene enormously more effective. And the way the music eerily fades quiet as all we're left with is the beeping from the heart monitor sends chills down my spine. The music and visuals wouldn't have been nearly as moving on their own if they didn't work together like this. And the near perfect execution of this scene making great use of these two aspects is what transforms this moment from what already would have been a cool scene to what is now one of my favorite moments of the entire series. This episode was far from perfect, but it got a lot right. It really felt like this episode was trying to fix some problems, and it turned out to be both a good thing and a bad thing for me. On one hand, the way they developed Spray Paint and Mouse's upbringing was a very good choice for the episode, and on the other hand, I didn't like how this episode tried to retcon Chapter 1. But I would still say that it's good to see that the creators are willing to learn from their mistakes. I mean, they were able to improve other aspects of the show, like the backgrounds and the overall atmosphere, so I definitely wouldn't say that their efforts were fully misplaced. And while I still think that the show has a long way to go, I would say that it's ultimately going down the right path. I want to take a moment to thank my first ever Patreon patron, Sequoia. I am truly sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. It's a really cool name and I feel bad for possibly butchering it. If you want to follow in Sequoia's magnificent footsteps, you can donate to my Patreon to get thanked in future videos. Absolutely no pressure. I'm honestly perfectly content with having any amount of patrons. Once again, thank you Sequoia for being my first patron, and thank you, the viewer, for watching. See you next time.